never thought I'd watch people cry over my coffin while I stood just a few feet away, breathing alive and invisible to them. The room smelled of lilies and expensive perfume, the kind you only wear when you want to look like you cared. My name, Ethan Vale, is written in gold on the plaque of the coffin. My face stared back at me from a giant framed portrait surrounded by candles. I had everything a man could want: money, power, respect, or at least I thought I did. But it wasn't until I faked my own death that I learned the truth about everyone around me. Just 2 weeks earlier, I'd been sitting in my office on the 54th floor of Vale Enterprises, signing deals worth millions, when I overheard a conversation that shattered everything. My so-called best friend and business partner, Damon Cross, was plotting behind my back, planning to push me out of my own company. I listened as he spoke to my secretary Somi, I trusted like familia, about transferring my shares after my unfortunate accident. The way they laughed sent chills down my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every person I thought was loyal to me suddenly looked like a stranger. My wife Claire had been distant for months, pretending to be worried about my workload, but I noticed the secretive smiles when she texted someone late at night. I began to wonder if the betrayal ran deeper than I could imagine. That's when I made the craziest decision of my life: to disappear. With the help of one man, I still trusted me old driver, Frank. I planned everything. A car crash on the mountain road, an explosion, no body recovered. The world believed Ethan Vale was dead. For 3 days, I hid in an old cabin outside the city, watching the news report my death. My company's shares skyrocketed. My friends gave emotional statements on camera, and my wife sobbed for the press. But behind her grief, I saw something else: relief. That's when I knew my funeral wouldn't be a goodbye. It would be a test. I was going to attend it, disguised and silent, to see who would mourn me. And who would celebrate my death? Asterisk, the morning of my funeral was gray and cold. The kind of day that seemed to echo the emptiness in my chest. I put on my disguise-a-gray wig, wrinkled latex mask, a pair of old glasses, and a black suit that hung loose around my shoulders. Frank drove me to the church in a beaten-up van, parking far enough so no one would recognize him. "You sure about this, Mr. Vale?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. "Once you see what you're about to see, there's no going back." I gave him a tired smile. "That's exactly what I want, Frank. No more lies." As I stepped out, I could already hear the faint sound of the choir singing inside. My own funeral? My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked toward the entrance, keeping my head down. People were dressed in black, their faces solemn, forced, some sincere. I slipped into a corner pew in the back, unnoticed. The first face I saw was Damon, my best friend. He sat in the front row, dabbing his eyes with a tissue, but I could see through the act. His watch gleamed, the one I gifted him when we sealed our first major deal. He was wearing it proudly, as if to remind everyone of his new position. Then I saw Claire, my wife. She looked stunning, even in grief. Whatever she was pretending was grief. Her makeup was perfect, her posture composed, her hand resting gently on Damon's arm for comfort. My stomach twisted. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was painted across their faces. The priest began to speak, calling me a visionary, a beloved husband and leader. Every word felt like a lie, echoing through the church. I watched as my employees sniffled and wiped their tears, some whispering about what would happen to the company now. The air was thick with hypocrisy. Then it happened. Damon leaned closer to Claire, whispering something that made her smirk. "Ah!" And she slipped her fingers into his hand. Right there at my funeral, they held hands like lovers. I gripped the pew until my knuckles turned white. Every part of me wanted to stand up and scream, to expose them right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. I needed to see how deep their betrayal went. Asterisk as the priest's voice faded into the soft hum of the organ. I felt the walls of the church closing in on me. My vision blurred between rage and disbelief. How could they stand there, hand in hand, pretending to mourn me while planning their next move together? The thought burned like acid in my chest. I kept my eyes fixed on them, watching every fake tear, every whisper. My heart had once trusted those people, my wife who shared my bed, and my best friend who built my empire beside me. Now, they were partners in betrayal. When the ceremony ended, people began to rise, murmuring condolences to Claire. She played her role perfectly graceful, soft-spoken, a widow too fragile to stand. Damon stayed close, offering her his arm. I followed at a distance as they made their way to the graveyard, where my empty coffin would be lowered into the ground. The sky darkened, clouds rolling heavy like a warning from above. I stood under a tree, the rain beginning to fall in thin, cold lines. As the priest said the final prayer, Claire lowered her head, and for a moment, I almost believed her tears were real. But then I heard her voice, low, but sharp enough for me to catch. "It's over, Damon," she whispered. "He's gone, finally." Damon smiled faintly and replied, "And now, everything he had is ours." That word stabbed deeper than any knife could. They waited until the last handful of dirt hit the coffin, then turned away, walking side by side under a shared umbrella. I clenched my fists so tight I could feel my nails cut into my skin. The few loyal faces left behind me, old driver Frank, my assistant Nora, and my lawyer stood quietly. Their sorrow real and heavy. At least not everyone had turned against me. When the crowd dispersed, I approached Frank, who lingered by the tree, pretending not to know me. "It's worse than I thought," I muttered. He nodded grimly. "What now?" he asked. I stared at the fresh mound of earth that bore my name. "Now," I said through gritted teeth, "Ethan Vale is truly dead. But the man who replaces him will make sure every one of them learns what it means to lose everything." Distressed that night. As the city lights flickered through the rain-soaked windows of Frank's van, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The face staring back wasn't my knight. It was older, broken, and filled with something I hadn't felt in years. Vengeance. "They think they've buried me," I whispered. "Let's make them wish they had." Frank glanced over at me, uneasy. "You're not planning anything crazy, are you?" I gave a dry laugh. "Frank, they killed me long before I faked my death." I spent the next few days hidden in the shadows, planning every move carefully. I used an old laptop Frank had kept from his security days to access my off-grid accounts money no one else knew about. Millions, safely tucked away under different names. With that, I could rebuild myself, piece by piece. My first step was to watch them. Damon had already taken over Vale Enterprises as interim CEO. News outlets called him the loyal partner carrying on Ethan's vision. Every headline was another knife twist. Claire, meanwhile, had moved out of our mansion and into a penthouse downtown, one Damon conveniently owned. I hacked into the company's internal system through an old backdoor I'd built years ago. Within minutes, I saw the truth. Damon was siphoning funds into offshore accounts, slowly bleeding the company dry while parading as a grieving friend. I watched the transactions in disgust, every number confirming what I already knew wasn't just a traitor. He was a thief. But it wasn't enough to expose him, not yet. I wanted him to trust the illusion, to believe the ghost of Ethan Vale would stay buried. Meanwhile, I began crafting my new identity. Lucas Grant, a low-profile investor from New York's Smione. No one would connect to me. I even created fake documentation, licenses, and social media profiles. If Damon could play pretend, so could I. I spent hours studying my reflection, changing my posture, my voice, my mannerisms until Ethan Vale no longer existed. Only Lucas remained. "What's the plan?" Frank asked one evening as we watched Damon on TV shaking hands with foreign investors. I smiled coldly. "The plan," I said, "is to make him believe he's untouchable. Right before I pull the ground out from under him." I started small, renting a plain office under the name Lucas Grant and hiring a careful accountant named May, who owed a favor to a friend. I funneled quiet investments through anonymous shell companies and bought failing branches of Vale Enterprises. In silence, so Damon would see only calm numbers, I attended investor dinners as Lucas, a man with no past and a slow smile, and people leaned in because mystery makes them listen. I planted suggestions about restructuring and stability that sounded reasonable and safe to ears desperate for certainty. I used that influence to introduce Lucas II, a network of small investors who could pressure the board to ask questions. Damon did not welcome. All the while I watched Claire from a distance through public posts and private investigators. Her new life glittering in photos like false light. I felt a cold mix of pity and disgust when I saw her at parties. Laughing with people who had only loved her access to my name memory kept me human late-night conversations with her. The quiet way her hand fit mine. The soft way she said my name. Those memories were a blade and a bomb at a charity gala where Damon gave another polished speech about legacy. I sat 2 tables away and let him drink his own applause. I could have exposed him then. Walked up and ripped the mask from his face. But I wanted a better moment than a scene of anger. I wanted a collapse that smelled like consequence and not like a tantrum, so I played patience. Pushing rumors, nudging analysts, letting whispers build into calls and calls into demands for transparency. Damon began to make mistakes as pressure mounted. He approved a risky loan to cover a gap he had created with phantom transfers. That loan left a paper trail, and his panic revealed the sloppy arrogance of a man who believed his lies were invisible. I fed documents to a reporter I had carefully cultivated. A journalist who had a hunger to expose greed, and who would not be bought. The story broke, and the front page put his face beside the words theft and betrayal. Investors pulled back, and the board demanded an audit. And Damon's confident grin shrank into a fevered frown. Claire called him more. Her voice softer when the cameras were off, but louder when the cameras were on. Using sorrow like a performance, watching their quiet triumph turn to frantic calls. Tightened something in my chest, but also sharpened my resolve. Every good revenge needs a moral center, and mine was not hatred, but the desire to make truth matter and to reclaim. What I had built, I watched from the shadows as the law moved in slowly but firmly. Documents and subpoenas like steady blows. When the first arrests were announced, I felt a strange relief. As if a weight had lifted from my shoulders, though my soul still bore the scars. My plan was not only to ruin Damon, but to force Claire and the others to face what their choices had cost them. To see if they could live with the consequences. I did not want triumphant joy. I wanted a sober reckoning and the chance to step forward when the smoke cleared and show. I was still alive. The day they arrested Damon felt like thunder answering. Months of silent reckoning I watched from a diner across the street while rain smeared the courthouse like a watercolor. My coffee cooled as cameras and microphones crowded the steps, turning every movement into a headline when Damon emerged flanked by officers. His suit hung wrong, his tie askew, and the smugness he once wore like armor had vanished. He tried to meet the reporters with a steady jaw. But a tremor betrayed him, and the words that fell from his mouth sounded thin and hollow. Claire waited nearby, wrapped in a dark coat that did nothing to hide the way her fingers twisted at the cuff. When someone called Damon's name, I saw a flicker of something: remorse. Calculation, fear. There was no clear face to the emotion, only a changing silhouette. Frank and Nora stood further back, their faces tired but resolute, the small, loyal circle that had believed in me when everyone else had turned away. In court, the prosecutor laid out the trail of numbers and transfers like a map that proved intent. Not accident, the evidence landed with a quiet brutality, each document another nail. Driven into the coffin of Damon's lies, he tried to speak. To turn explanations into stories. It was oversight, a miscommunication, he said. But the ledger offered a colder narrative. Claire's voice during testimony was small, and then steady. She admitted to meetings and messages she had called innocent, and answered questions that no longer had shelter in secrecy. Listening to her peel away the rehearsed lines, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and grief. For a version of our life that could have been different, the judge's words, when the indictment was read, sounded like both a judgment and an opening. Because accountability is never only punishment. It is also the chance to rebuild truth. When the first officials left with Damon in custody, I stepped into the rain and felt the weight of what I had set in motion, and the emptiness that sometimes follows revenge. Frank reached out, his voice low. "Do you want to reveal yourself now?" And I looked at the courthouse lights reflected in puddles and shook my head. Not yet, there's more to watch. The truth had begun unspooling, and I would choose the moment to step back. Into the world on my own terms, asterisk. Weeks passed and the city began to forget the scandal as news stories claimed the headlines, but for me each day felt like walking through the ruins of my old life. I stayed in a small apartment under the name Lucas Grant, spending long nights staring out the window at the skyline. I once ruled I watched Vale Enterprises rebuild under temporary leadership as investigations continued my company, my creation, now a battlefield of lawyers and frightened investors. I should have felt satisfied, but all I could feel was the hollow echo of betrayal, mixed with a quiet longing for the man I used to be. Frank visited, often bringing food and updates. They're saying Damon might plead guilty, he told me one evening, and Claire's vanished from the city. No one's seen her since the last court hearing. I nodded but said nothing. There was part of me that didn't want to know where she went because knowing would bring back the ache of memory. I tried to distract myself by helping Frank with small jobs under my alias, consulting for struggling firms, using my knowledge quietly to repair what greed had broken. It felt strange doing good again after months of vengeance. In secrecy, one afternoon, I got an email from Nora, the assistant who had truly mourned me. She wrote that Vale Enterprises was sinking fast because the new board couldn't hold it together without my guidance. She said the employees who once whispered doubts now spoke my name with respect, and regret. Reading her words made my throat tighten. I realized that while I had been chasing revenge, the thing I'd built was slipping into dust. I had proven the truth but lost the purpose. Damon and Claire had taken pieces of my life, but I had allowed them to take my peace too. That night I stood in front of the mirror, peeled off the disguise, and stared at the face I had hidden from the world. The lines were deeper, the eyes colder, but behind them burned something stronger than anger, the will to start again. Ethan Vale died once, I whispered to my reflection, but this time when he returns, it won't be for revenge, it will be for redemption. Asterisk. The next morning, I walked out into the city as myself for the first time in months. No disguise, no fear, just the weight of truth pressing on my shoulders. The sun felt different, sharp and honest. Cutting through the fog that had followed me since that day at my funeral, I knew it was time to stop hiding and reclaim what I had lost. But not with anger, with purpose. I went straight to Nora's small office, the one she had managed to keep, running even as the company crumbled. When she saw me standing in the doorway, her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with disbelief. Mr. Vale, she whispered, her voice trembling. Is it really you? I nodded slowly. It's me, Nora, but let's keep it between us for now. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stepped closer. Everyone thought you were gone, she said. I almost quit after the funeral. I placed a hand on her shoulder. I know you stayed loyal, and because of that, we still have something worth saving together. We spent hours reviewing the company's remaining assets, tracing what could be recovered from Damon's schemes. It was chaos, but there was still hope. I began meeting quietly with old clients under my name again, explaining the truth only to those who needed to know. The reaction was always the same: shock, then relief, then respect. Some called me crazy for faking my death, but others called me brave. They didn't know it wasn't bravery, it was desperation. I contacted Frank too, asking him to help gather our old team of trusted employees. We met in a dim warehouse one evening, the air filled with tension and disbelief. When I stepped out of the shadows, their eyes widened as if they were seeing a ghost. Ethan Vale is back, I said, my voice steady, and this time we rebuild from the ashes. A quiet murmur ran through the room, then applause, hesitant at first, then real for the first time in what felt like forever. I smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man who had won revenge, but of someone who had finally remembered why he started everything in the first place: to build something honest, to give people a reason to believe again. Rebuilding wasn't glamorous. It was brutal and humbling. I worked 12-hour days in silence, meeting with suppliers who once turned me away, negotiating from scratch without the power my name used to command. Every signature, every handshake felt like a second chance carved from stone. The employees who remained loyal worked beside me, not for me, and I learned something I had forgotten years ago: that leadership wasn't control. It was connection. I visited the old Vale Enterprises building one evening when the sun dipped behind the skyline, and the glass reflected nothing but fire and shadow inside the lobby. Everything smelled like dust and memory. The gold letters of my name still clung to the marble wall. Though some had begun to fade, I ran my fingers over the cold, surface and felt both pride and pain. You built this from nothing. I whispered to myself, you can do it again a few days later. Nora handed me a small envelope with trembling hands. Sir, someone left this at the front desk for you. No name inside was a folded piece of paper. Handwritten in elegant loops, it was from Claire. The words hit harder than I expected. Ethan, I don't deserve forgiveness. I thought I loved you once. But I let greed rewrite everything I believed in. Damon promised freedom but gave me chains. I'm leaving the city. I hope you live. Really live, not like before. Goodbye. I read it twice. Then burned it in the small trash can beside my desk. The ashes curled and disappeared, and with them, the last of my bitterness. She's gone. Frank asked quietly. I nodded. Let her be gone. It wasn't revenge I wanted anymore. It was release. I turned my focus to building something better. A new company under a new name, Vale Innovation. Sure, every decision came from collaboration, not competition. Slowly, investors returned. Drawn not by my wealth, but by my resolve, I became a symbol of resurrection. Not just survival. And late at night, when I looked at the city from my new office window, I no longer saw ghosts. Only light stretching into possibility. The man who had attended his own funeral had finally come back to life. Months later, I stood on the balcony of the new Vale Innovations headquarters overlooking the city that had once buried me. The skyline shimmered like a sea of possibilities, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace below. The hum of life continued. Voices, laughter, all moving forward, just as I had. My name was no longer whispered with scandal, but spoken with quiet admiration. The papers called me the man who rose from his own ashes, but I didn't care about headlines anymore. I cared about people, ones who had stood beside me when everything fell apart. Nora had become the company's backbone. Frank managed logistics. And together, we built something that no betrayal could destroy. I often thought back to that day in the church, watching my own coffin surrounded by liars and mourners. How strange it felt now to know that moment of pain had been the spark that set me free. I had been living blind to the truth, believing loyalty could be bought with kindness or trust could be assumed just because you gave it freely. The funeral had shown me who truly cared, but it also showed me something more profound. It taught me how to start again. One evening, as the last employees left the office, Nora approached me holding a small photo she had found during the renovation. It was from the old days. Claire and Damon standing together, smiling like fools, frozen in innocence. I looked at it for a long moment before taking it gently from her hand. Keep it, I said finally. Let it remind us where ambition ends and integrity begins. She nodded and smiled faintly before turning off the lights. When the building grew quiet, I leaned on the railing and whispered into the wind. I attended my own funeral to see who would cry, but what I saw instead was who truly lived. I realized that sometimes you have to let the world believe you're gone too. Find out what's worth coming back. For the man who once built an empire out of pride had built a new one out of purpose. And as the night air wrapped around me, I knew Ethan Vale hadn't just survived, had finally learned how to live.